In this section, I want to take a little closer look at what Taiwan, is producing for export, what's happening to the international market for these exports, and how Taiwan is producing these exports. If you look at the statistics, what Taiwan is mainly producing to export is things like clothes and shoes, particularly women's clothes and shoes, but also men's, accessories, things like purses, toys, and also cheaper consumer electronics. Down here, I show a picture of some of the stuff that would have been produced in an economy like Taiwan's. The one picture of the Christmas tree. In the 1970s, if you were a child, there's a good chance that over half of the stuff under your Christmas tree would have been from Taiwan. And the Christmas tree ornaments, if you were in the United States, would have probably been largely made in Taiwan. There's a simple story that they used to tell when I was in college back in the 1970s about economic development. And it's based on originally the three big production factors: land, labor, and capital. And the story would always start out with an agricultural economy. Okay? Agricultural economy, the people are using their land to produce crops. Okay, so that's a land-intensive economy. That's the beginning. That's considered a rather backward sort of economy. But what happens is that as people get better and better at producing crops, they start having more children, the population builds up. Soon there's not a lot of land out there per person. Now what you have in abundance is labor. And so you've got to move from land-intensive production to labor-intensive production. And in particular, you move toward labor-intensive manufacturing. And so that's kind of the first step in economic development. Now, you start out with this labor-intensive development, but if you do a good job with it, you start building up capital. People have money, they can save it. They can use it to they send it to the bank, and the business people will use it to buy more machinery, to buy more sophisticated factories. So what eventually happens is you can move on to a capital-intensive economy, where you still have labor working, but it's working. Each worker is working with lots of capital. Capital-intensive production would be heavy industry, such as maybe a steel mill. So you're moving up the line from agriculture to labor-intensive manufacturing, something like textiles, on to capital-intensive manufacturing, something like steel. That's the way you develop your economy according to the old model. Now, about the time that model was being developed, something else was coming along. New things like electronics. And by the 1980s, it was getting kind of hard to deny that, really it didn't seem like the rich countries were moving so much into heavy industry as they were moving more and more into this high-tech industry. So we kind of add another production factor in there: human capital. Okay, and the idea then is there's going to be four stages now. You go from producing agriculture in a land-intensive economy, you build up the amount of labor, and then you go to labor-intensive manufacturing, something like textiles, and then you build up enough capital there that you can go into heavy industry. You put up, say, like steel mills, shipbuilding yards, and then once you get really lots of money, you start putting more and more money into your human capital, into education, things like this. And then you develop a skilled workforce that can go into things like high-tech electronics. So that would be the addition, kind of what's added on to the story in the 1980s, 1990s. They talk more about that. But it's assumed that there's kind of a ladder. And this simple ladder is what all countries climb in order to economically develop. You start out at agriculture, you move up to textiles, labor-intensive production, then you go up to capital-intensive production, something like steel mills. Finally, you get up there to high-tech stuff like electronics. Of course, nowadays, the richest countries seem to be more into service industries. I'm not sure how that really is supposed to be explained. Okay? But this is just one simple way of looking at economic development. I don't think it's very appropriate to what we see in Taiwan. Okay? Taiwan did have cheap labor, and so early on they did go into this labor-intensive manufacturing. But lots of countries had cheap labor at this time. Many countries had cheaper labor than Taiwan. If it's just a matter of cheap labor, why didn't India or Pakistan or African countries or Burma, Cambodia, why didn't one of these countries take Taiwan's place? I think that Taiwan succeeded, by focusing on a certain type of labor-intensive good. Okay, that was the kind of the speed-intensive goods. Okay, and they were the comparative advantage for Taiwan was not really labor; it was more flexibility. Of course, this involves labor because the most flexible of your inputs to the production process is labor. Labor is much more flexible generally than machine tools are. So flexibility is what I concentrate on when I'm trying to explain Taiwan's success. Taiwan's early production networks, they could react very quickly to market change. They could change around. Okay, you're working with one person, now you're working with another person, now you're working with 5 people. Okay, they had these networks, okay, that were constantly changing. And so whatever the market demanded, suddenly the US market needed some particular simple toy, but it had to be there for Christmas Day. Okay, Taiwan could produce it. Okay, Taiwan was fast enough that they could ramp up production and give the Americans what they wanted. Okay, so the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, they're kind of meshing together in these ever-changing supply chains. Okay, and these small and medium enterprises, they're known as being cutthroat competitive. Okay, and if they're always out for the contract, they'll do anything to get it. They'll undercut any competitor. But once they get the contract, they have to be cooperative, because usually the contract doesn't quite meet their production possibilities. They need to do a lot of things like subcontracting. Okay? They need to find other people who work with them. Maybe there's particular parts of the what they want to produce that they can't produce themselves. They got to find somebody else who will produce that for them. Okay? So Taiwan's SMEs, they're special in that they are very competitive, but at the same time very cooperative. It's kind of a game they're playing. They're all playing it to win, but they know that the way you win this game is to get people together in your group. Okay, and you win as kind of a group activity. Of course, in the next round, you may have to get into another group. Okay, so it's all kind of short-term relationships. This is the way it was in the hat industry, and to some extent, it was the way it was in the tea industry. So when I'm looking at the foundations of Taiwan's success in the 1960s, okay, I tend to go back and look at when these small business networks were created back during the early period in the late Qing and then primarily in the Japanese period. I think that was kind of what laid the foundation for Taiwan's success. Many people will argue that you don't want to go back that far. They try to find the foundations for success in the 1950s. And there's a lot happening in the 1950s, and a lot of it's good. The 1950s were a period of recovery, and if Taiwan hadn't recovered for some of the disastrous crises they had in the 1940s, they probably couldn't have gone on to success in the mid-1960s. But I don't see this period of recovery as being really the foundation of Taiwan's success. It seems like during that period, there's a lot of things that are being done wrong. Taiwan is going in a direction that's very different than the direction it's going to go from the mid-1960s on. So I tend to see the 1950s as a much more ambiguous period than I think most economic historians do. Okay. I want to look at some of the statistics, okay, just to show you what's happening in Taiwan and what's happening generally in the world as far as speed-intensive production is concerned. I want to show you these two tables, and then I'm going to add on and show you an extra graph that I've tagged on here. Right, this first table here, I'm looking at imports to the U.S. because the U.S. was definitely Taiwan's most important market. Okay, in 1953 U.S. dollar, in thousands of U.S. dollars, and then parentheses I have the annual growth rate. And I've started out in 1953. I think that was the earliest statistics I found that were done the way I needed them done. And then I look at every 10 years after that. What you can see is the first column tells you what's happening to total imports to the U.S. And in real terms, from 1953 all the way up to 2003, looks like real imports to the United States went up by almost 20 times. So there's a big growth in international trade, and the U.S. market is a big part of this. Okay, during this era, that's total imports. What I want to focus on though is the speed-intensive imports. Okay? Speed intensive, I think I mentioned that I did this This is all statistics that I gathered when I was doing a paper for the world economy, okay, some years back. Okay. I decided what a speed-intensive industry is by looking at a bunch of categories and then looking at what the chance was that that category's goods would be shipped by air freight. And then I had to control by weight. Okay, so I had to put kind of a weight control there. And then once you control for weight, you look and see, are they shipping more than expected or less than expected? And you find there's a number of categories that are clearly shipping much more than expected by air freight. These are the categories I label as speed intensive. And basically they're the clothes and the shoes and the accessories. These are fashion goods. And in the United States, I think now there's about 6 seasons every year for these fashionable goods. You get the goods into the store, and then for the first month or two, that's when you make your money. And then often they're kind of thrown into the bargain basement bin, and they're sold, maybe even at a loss. Okay? So it's very important to get these markets to market right on time, right when they're needed. Toys are another thing that are very fashionable. Each Christmas people want different things, and there's always a big Christmas rush. Okay? A new movie comes out, there's always a bunch of particular toys associated with this movie, and toys have to be there when the movie is hot. Okay? So toys are very speed intensive. Finally, I also look at electronic goods, and that's because of technology. The technology was constantly advancing, so they wanted the goods, when a new technology came out, they wanted the good that used that technology into the market as fast as possible. They knew that very soon maybe better technology would come along, and then there would be other goods out there that would outsell this older good. The other category, which is the category that the toys were in generally, is just other category. Taiwan was always good at other. That's its best category. And that's because Taiwan was very good at looking for niches. These niches are small things. Often they're only lasting, maybe it's markets that only lasted for a short period so far. They haven't really been defined yet by the government. And so you always find a lot of Taiwan production in this other market. Well, I define the speed-intensive goods. You look at 1953, and you find that only about 2% of U.S. U.S. imports are speed-intensive goods. And most of these are not really speed-intensive. I noticed, for example, that a lot of these were clothing, but they're not really fashionable clothing. A lot of the clothing imported to the United States in 1953 were things like underwear, undershirts, things that you didn't have to worry about styles for. Okay? So this 2% is really an overestimate. Okay? If you get into 1963, okay, now we're up to, maybe 7%. Okay, we've got a big rise in speed-intensive goods compared to total imports. Okay, you're up over 10%, maybe about 12% or so in 1973. Eventually, 2003, we're up to something like 25% of the goods coming into the United States are speed-intensive. So, in the early days, most speed-intensive goods, they weren't imported because it just took too long. Okay, without the communications I've talked about, without the transportation, the container shipping, most people would have thought it was crazy to try to order something from abroad if you were in a hurry for it. Okay? You could only order stuff from abroad if it was a steady market that you knew would be there next year. Okay? But times change, and as the 20th century goes along, more and more of these speed-intensive goods can be imported, and the number of speed-intensive goods people use increase. Okay? Now we use lots of electronics and things like this. Okay? Now, the third column here, I look at speed-intensive goods being imported to the United States from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. Okay, this is just looking at that. Thought maybe there's something special about the Chinese markets here. Hong Kong was the biggest leader in these speed-intensive exports, and they got the jump on Taiwan. Okay? But you can see that in 1953, almost nothing that speed-intensive was coming from this Chinese area. Okay? 3 out of 223 of the $1,000 worth of the goods were coming from here. There's a huge jump in this by 1963. It's up to over 10% of speed-intensive goods are coming from this Chinese area. Okay, and this increases. Okay, when we get into 1973, now it's up to about maybe 25%. When we get to 2003, it looks like about 40% of the speed-intensive goods coming to the United States are coming from the Chinese area. Okay. Now, originally, I put this in because I thought maybe there were some cultural relationships here that determined why they had such advantage in speed intensity. Maybe it was something due to some Chinese business network trait. Okay, so I was looking at Chinese business networks. Now I'm not sure. Maybe Hong Kong and Taiwan had a similar imperial experience, so that they both were, their business people tended to be small-scale, mammals living among the big imperialist dinosaurs, and they were good at finding these nooks and crannies in which they could survive. Maybe this is the skill that was learned, and it doesn't have much to do with any sort of original Chinese business culture. China, after it opens up, okay, and here we really don't see much coming out of China in 1983. Not yet. 1993, 2003, that's when you get a lot of stuff coming out of China. Again, in this period, a lot of the stuff coming out of China is actually stuff that's being produced there by Taiwanese and Hong Kong people. Okay, so this is kind of an extension of the business networks, okay, during that period. In the fourth column, I also look at other little dragons, okay, Japan and Singapore and South Korea, the other little dragons, and the big dragon, Japan, okay. I see how they look. You can see that, they're also growing, okay. They originally, and this is primarily Japan, was producing quite a bit more speed-intensive goods than Hong Kong and Taiwan were producing, okay. By about 1993, the Chinese area is pulled about even. By 2003, it's very much dominated by the Chinese area, okay. I think what's happening here is that early on, the Japanese had a good advantage in this. South Korea also, when they began opening up, they opened up at first using a lot of speed-intensive production. But both Japan and Korea ended up going more and more into heavy enterprises and going a different direction and leaving the speed-intensive markets more to Taiwan and Hong Kong and their branch companies in China. If you look at speed-intensive imports to the United States from the rest of the world, I do this because if the change that's occurring is just occurring maybe like in Taiwan and Hong Kong, then I would expect that Taiwan and Hong Kong would be pushing other people out of the speed-intensive imports industries, okay, taking it over themselves, and these other producers would be being displaced. What you find, though, is that even though the other producers, their speed-intensive imports to the United States aren't growing nearly as fast as Taiwan's and Hong Kong's are growing, okay, they are still growing. Okay. This seems to show that it really is speed-intensive imports, okay, speed-intensive trade. This is growing, and it's affecting everybody. Okay, everybody has more opportunities with speed-intensive trade. It just so happens that Taiwan, Hong Kong, they make the best use of these opportunities. Another graph here, I want to look a little more, carefully at at these different type of speed-intensive exports as a percent of all net exports. What I do here is when I look at net exports, I'm only looking at the excess of exports over imports. And if there's some category where imports are greater than exports, that's just zero. I don't even look at that. So I'm looking at all the categories where exports exceed imports. And then I look at how much they exceed the imports, and then what percent of these excess exports are in the speed-intensive category. Okay. Well, the first place I look at here is Hong Kong. You can see that in Hong Kong, 1953, already half of the net exports of Hong Kong are in the speed-intensive categories, primarily in apparel, clothing. Okay. Then by 1963, you're over 90%, and you stay over 90% all the way down to 2003, the last year I do this. Okay. Some years it's almost 100%. Hong Kong's net exports, almost every category in which they exported more than they imported, were speed intensive. And Hong Kong was most focused on apparel, clothing, though also this various, other category, mainly toys, is also important for Hong Kong. Taiwan, 1953, there's almost nothing coming into the United States. So we start in 1963. 1963, Taiwan still has not started doing the speed-intensive exports. It's still, doing mainly agricultural stuff. By 1973, over half of what they export is now speed intensive. And then this rises up into over 80% by 1983. When we get to 1993 and 2003, we start seeing a fall off in speed intensive exports from Taiwan. One thing that's happening is that more and more the Taiwanese are investing in mainland China, and then they're sending a lot of, say, intermediate goods to mainland China, and then the Taiwan company in mainland China is shipping out the speed intensive goods to the United States and other Western markets. Okay. So the Taiwan arises using speed intensive exports. Later on we'll talk about when they start offshoring a lot of these exports. China, 1984 is the first time I get statistics for them here in this source. By 1993, over 2/3 China's exports, net exports, are speed intensive. And a lot of these are, being exported by Hong Kong and Taiwan companies with branches in China. Now I put in Japan for comparison. 1953, Japan's exports, 10% of them are speed intensive. That's, I said the United States was just importing about 2% of its, imports were speed intensive. So 10%, that's pretty good for this period. This rises to 22% in 1963. But then it starts stalling, okay? If you look at the different categories, you can see what happens is that later on, Japan does, it kind of pulls up using consumer electronics, but it's exporting lots of other things as well. Things like automobiles, ships, okay, steel. So Japan, although, an economy that grew very quickly in the 1950s and 60s, very similar to Taiwan, in this way it wasn't similar to Taiwan. It started off, it did have a lot of speed-intensive exports to the United States, okay, compared with what was possible at the time in the 1950s and 60s, but then they moved on to other things. I didn't have room here for South Korea, but for South Korea, you would see something kind of similar. Early on, there was a period that South Korea had maybe half of its net exports being speed-intensive, but then they move away from this as they go more into heavy industry. This is a graph kind of showing the difference between textiles and apparel. Okay, and apparel here, just clothing. Okay, actually the main thing here to start out looking at is the brown and the blue. Okay, blue, that's Hong Kong. Brown, that's Japan. If you look at Japan, Japan has always been a net exporter of textiles. Okay, this is subtracting the exports from the imports to look at what's happening here. Okay, though in this case, if the imports are greater than exports, I do put down a negative value here. But you can see that Japan's textile exports all the way up into the 1980s are getting more and more positive. Japan is a big exporter of textiles. If you look at the apparel, clothing, early on they did export some apparel, okay, but by the mid-1970s they become apparel importers. So that's Japan's direction. These are both textiles and clothing, which is a textile product, are often lumped together in one group. But the characteristics of these different products are quite different. Okay, and it seems clear here that Japan was very good. It had a comparative advantage in producing textiles for export. It didn't have a comparative advantage in apparel. It tended to, in the end, have this done abroad. Hong Kong is exactly the opposite. Okay? If you look at the solid line, was the textile industry. Although Hong Kong did have a textile industry, it always imported more textiles than it exported. Okay? It was a textile importer. When you look at the dotted line, or the slash line, that goes up just like, up and up and up, just like the Japanese textile exports do. Okay, but that is to Hong Kong clothing. Hong Kong exported more and more clothes as time went on. Okay, their specialty was in making clothes, not in making textiles. They had to import many of their textiles. The green is Taiwan. Taiwan is more like Hong Kong than like Japan, but the Hong Kong government was very much supporting the textile industry in Taiwan. Often they restricted imports of textiles into Taiwan. So Taiwan's textile exports were positive, but they weren't as big as the clothing exports. And clothing exports were more important for Taiwan. But because of the support for the textile industry in Taiwan, I think this did make it harder for Taiwan's clothing manufacturers. Sometimes they may have been situations where they were kind of forced to buy Taiwan products. They were having a hard time importing foreign textile. Okay. So what happens with Taiwan, and you can see this in one of the earlier tables I showed you, is they do not go as much into clothing as Hong Kong does. Taiwan was more into, say, things like shoes and toys. Okay. Now, how were Taiwan's speed-intensive goods produced? And I've already said something about this, but I want to just kind of make it a little clearer. They're produced in small factories, sometimes medium-sized factories. Here in this picture, you see what would be a big factory as far as Taiwan is concerned. Often, if you wanted a bigger factory in Taiwan, you tended to use female labor. It seemed like they thought that was easier to manage. For men, they were probably in the smallest factories. Okay? You know, here is kind of doing some basic metalworking. Okay? A lot of the work in Taiwan was done in these small factories. And you can see, of course, a small factory like this, it had to work with other factories to get a whole product done. Okay? Many of these small factories just specialized in a few different production processes. Okay? So factories had to work together, okay, to be able to create products for the export market. In Taiwan, the government finally caught on to what was happening, and they started their own program to try to encourage this sort of production. They started talking about living rooms as factories, okay? Trying to say, people, we got to open up and we want to produce more stuff. We can just, produce the stuff at home. And you see a lot of this in Taiwan, a lot of this putting out where people at home are producing things just for some factory. If the factory has a big rush order for some sort of clothing, it can't get it all done within the factory. Usually what happens is it has connections with many women that work at home, and they just start giving them orders, saying, we need buttonholes in this, we need some collars for this, okay? And then a lot of the simple work is just done at home and then sent into the factories. Now, Taiwan ran into a number of problems. One of the problems in Taiwan is the upstream problem. Okay? And we've talked about in the 1950s some of the new industries that were coming around. A lot of stuff was being done by the state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are often not that efficient, and that's a big problem often in many countries. Okay, I don't want to particularly say Taiwan's were particularly inefficient, but I think they did have efficiency problems sometimes, like most of the rest of the world did. When it wasn't state-owned enterprise, often there's kind of a cartel set up. It was more of an oligopoly. That's what happened in the textile market. Okay. Plastics, that was also something which is very few companies producing plastic. It was more of an oligopoly. Oligopolies, you often get monopoly profits, so the costs will also be high. There's also a lot of protection in Taiwan. In theory, they tried to make it easier for exporters to import the sort of raw materials and intermediate goods they needed, capital equipment, but it was often a bureaucratic process. I think the problem wasn't so much maybe the high tariffs as it just was the time it took to do this. Okay, sometimes the government just worked too slowly. So this was, I think, some of the biggest problems that Taiwan's speed-intensive small business networks had to overcome. How do you overcome these problems? And one thing you have to understand is that the problems I'm describing here are problems that you see throughout the developing world. So Taiwan's competitors or potential competitors all face the same problem. Okay, so Taiwan is not facing a especially hard difficulty. Things are going to be a little more expensive for Taiwan because of this upstream problem, but it's more expensive for everybody. They all have the same problem. Another thing to keep in mind is that there were monopoly profits, and the state-owned enterprises often did make some extra money, but because of these profits and the money the state-owned enterprises were making, that kept the taxes lower for Taiwan. Okay, the government was getting quite a bit of money from the upstream. Okay, and as long as they were getting money there was less pressure for them to try to squeeze tax money out of these small and medium enterprises. So the small and medium enterprises often paid very little in taxes, and that made up for this upstream problem in many ways. Finally, one of the advantages Taiwan had was that there's not a lot of, regulations enforced in the Taiwan business networks at this time. Now, this I don't think is no longer true, and it's probably one of the reasons that a lot of these small business, networks have moved overseas. Right? But during this period, people are running living rooms as factories, and sometimes the living room factories are getting pretty big, and they're getting a lot of equipment. Okay? In 1978, when I walked down the streets in Taiwan, even in residential areas, you would often see the first floor. You'd look in and you'd see machine tools. Okay? If you look on paper, there's rules against things like pollution. There's also rules about things concerning safety. Okay? But these rules are very seldom enforced. Okay? So this is another way that Taiwan is overcoming, the problem with the, more expensive upstream production. They can produce cheaper than most other producers, okay, because they aren't regulated. Okay? And of course, this creates problems of its own. Okay, Taiwan was kind of a dirty, unsafe place, but it was able to make money and grow at a very fast rate, okay, because everything was so loose and uncontrolled. Another thing that helped Taiwan was foreign direct investment. Okay? I didn't used to push this idea so much. Okay, lately I've read something by one of the other professors in our department, Wu Chongming. He's looked a lot at the foreign direct investment, and he's kind of convinced me that it is a lot more important than I used to think. This graph here shows, in the early period up to 1980, the foreign direct investment is a percent of gross capital formation. Okay, this is, these are investment mainly in factories and manufacturing being made by foreign companies. They're coming in and they're setting up factories in Taiwan. I used to look at this and say, well, 4% and then rising to about, maybe 9 or 10%, then falling back to about 3%. Is this really important? Okay. But then when, I look at gross capital formation for the other countries in the world at this time, this is actually a pretty large amount of foreign direct investment. Now, when you do foreign direct investment in Taiwan, there are regulations. They usually tried to say that any foreign direct investment had to focus on export markets. Okay? So you couldn't really do foreign direct investment to kind of produce upstream goods to help out the Taiwanese, small and medium enterprise networks. But you could producing goods that were mainly being shipped abroad, and this was good training for a lot of Taiwanese managers and technical people. Okay? I think the reason that Taiwan early on has more foreign direct investment than most of these new countries is because they began with overseas Chinese. After colonies get their independence, there's this big hostility toward imperialism, and a lot of foreign direct investment looks like imperialism. Why do we want this Western powers coming back in and using our people, our resources, to produce things that they're going to control? We want to control our own destiny. We don't want this foreign direct investment. Well, Taiwan kind of edged into this, first by mainly pushing the idea of using overseas Chinese investment. That didn't seem quite as imperialistic. Okay? Now, actually, overseas Chinese investment never becomes near as big as foreign direct investment becomes. Okay? But it is kind of the first crack in the door that allows Taiwan to start experimenting with using this foreign capital. So Taiwan's foreign direct investment is larger than most other places, and a lot of the early, larger consumer goods factories in Taiwan, were done with foreign direct investment. One of the stories about this is a story of the Singer sewing machine. And you might not know anything about Singer sewing machines if you're young, because the company's no longer really around, I don't think. But it used to be by far the most important sewing machine company in the world. Well, if you read a book in English, The Foreign Factor by Xue, he's another old professor at NTU. It looks like Chai Shive, I guess the way he spells his name in English, but it's Xue in Chinese. In his book, he describes the Singer in foreign direct investment as kind of a good example of what foreign direct investment was like in Taiwan. Okay? In 1962 in Taiwan, there was 250 companies that made every year about 39,000 sewing machines. Okay? You think about this, this is, a little over 100 sewing machines per company. Okay? These are very small scale operations. And these operations, there wasn't much standardization. Each company made its own type of sewing machine. So there's not a lot of, exchangeable parts here. If your machine breaks down, you got to kind of machine a new part. Okay? Singer says they want to come in Taiwan and they want to start making sewing machines in Taiwan. Well, the sewing machine industry in Taiwan was against this. They say, we're making 39,000 machines a year. That's all that's needed in Taiwan. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, and our machines, they're not that bad. Okay, so they were resistant to this. Well, in 1963, the government decided we are going to let Singer come into Taiwan. Now, they had a lot of conditions to this. Okay? One thing they said almost all your machines are going to have to be exported. And that's what happened. Singer exports almost all of its machines. Okay? Another thing is it says, the parts you use that you don't make yourself, we don't want you importing these parts. Most of the parts are going to have to be made in Taiwan. So Taiwan, the Singer company is required to train lots of these parts suppliers so that they can make standardized parts up to Singer's quality standards. Well, when they start doing this, okay, these people, they start learning. Okay, 140 parts suppliers, that's about half as many as originally as companies just making sewing machines in Taiwan. So this is a large number of people now that are making sewing machine parts, a big addition to what had been, what the sewing machine industry originally had. Okay? By 1972, there's 1 million sewing machines now being made in Taiwan for export. And most of these are not Singer machines. Okay? Singer makes the most expensive machines, and they export them, to more high-class, consumers throughout Asia. Okay? But most Asians wanted cheaper machines that were, just good enough. And that's what the Taiwanese rivals to Singer produced. Okay? So Singer had to train these parts makers. These parts makers started making parts for other machine companies. Some of them became sewing machine producer companies themselves from what they learned from Singer. Okay, Litzer was one of the big ones that was very important until their factory finally burned down. But this is also important, of course, for Taiwan's textile industry. 1963, clothing industry. The clothing industry. 1963, the clothing industry really hadn't got started. Once Singer comes in and starts training these parts suppliers, you start getting better and better sewing machines in Taiwan. Without this Singer investment, the clothing exports from Taiwan would have come much later. So, this is an example of the sort of foreign direct investment that came into Taiwan and the effects it could have on the Taiwan economy. Now, one of the things Taiwan does early on is they set up export processing zones. Okay? Now, these are zones where they're fenced in, and you locate in the zone. And if you locate in the zone, you have to only produce exports. You can't produce for the domestic economy. But you don't have to pay a lot of the taxes other companies have to pay. You don't have to undergo a lot of the regulations the other companies have to pay. You're much freer. It's kind of a free trade zone. These were controversial when they were first set up in Taiwan. You can imagine that when the KMT was in China earlier, one of the things that they didn't like were these areas of foreign concessions in Shanghai and other cities on the coast where foreigners were actually in control. This seems a little bit like that almost. They're setting up little foreign trading areas where it's mainly going to be foreign companies. They're all going to be using Taiwan labor to produce things for foreigners. Okay? Is this something good? It's also a little bit peculiar that you're able to produce all this stuff for foreigners without these taxes and regulations. Why not let the Taiwan consumers benefit as well? Of course, the answer is that the foreign markets are very competitive, and you've got to cut down taxes and regulations, or you're not going to be able to compete there. Okay, Taiwan consumers, they're going to be forced to take whatever comes along. Okay? But they set these things up. It grows by about 1970s. That's where the peak of exports coming from export processing zones, come. I guess the peak is about 1974. About 8% of Taiwan's exports are coming from these zones. Okay. This is, again, it's a good thing for Taiwan. There's probably a lot of people in the zones that are learning better about the foreign markets and about how to run larger scale production, okay, under the foreign direction and foreign managers. Some of Taiwan's engineers are getting jobs there, and they're getting better at their jobs, and maybe they'll use their skills later on with a Taiwanese company. Okay. But these export processing zones, they are limited. You know, it's less than 10% of the exports coming out of there, so you don't want to emphasize them too much. But this foreign direct investment was something that Taiwan, was very open to compared to other countries. And this will become particularly important when we talk about the electronics industry. Okay, as far as the export boom is concerned, I want to add one more thing here, agriculture. Okay. You know, when people talk about the export boom, I mean, you kind of look and say, well, what was happening is Taiwan's manufacturing, because they're the ones that are really booming. Maybe something's changing there. But actually, this consumer export boom, in some ways, goes beyond the manufacturing sector, and goes into the agricultural sector. And you start seeing speed-intensive agriculture. Okay, that's what I'm going to call it. Okay. These are two fruit booms in Taiwan. Now, the big fruit boom was the banana boom. Okay, and this begins when the Japanese open up their market to banana imports. Okay. Before that, to send bananas into Japan, which is where a lot of the Taiwan bananas went, you had to negotiate with the government. It was kind of a bilateral monopoly situation where the banana buyer organization in Japan, under the government, could negotiate with the Taiwan banana sellers, and see how much Taiwan bananas would be allowed into the country. Okay. Well, you can see that during the Japanese era, when Taiwan was a Japanese colony, there was more bananas let in, maybe about 200,000 tons a year. That had fallen to about 100,000 tons a year after the war. Okay. Well, they decontrol this. Japan finally, in the mid-1960s, they decide we're rich enough, we can allow our consumers to eat as many bananas as they want. And they start opening up this trade. Taiwan reacts to this very fast. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 years. They reach this huge peak. Many, many more bananas are being produced now than had ever been produced in the past. You're up to maybe 3.5 times as much as you were producing before the war. And some places down south, there's a place in Kaohsiung area, they used to talk about the banana sea, where virtually every plot of land, even little pieces of land that were the front yard of houses in the city, everything was planted with bananas. Okay. You had this huge banana boom. It's just amazing how fast it happened. Now later on, there gets to be some problems with diseases, but I think the main problem is that finally other countries that are slower moving, they gradually catch on. They've got, lower wages. So you see bananas coming to Japan from places like the Philippines, other Southeast Asian countries. Okay? And Taiwan gradually kind of loses the market. But when the door opens up, the Taiwanese rush in. So the speed-intensive production is not something that's just, a matter of in the manufacturing industry. Pineapples, you see there it's a little slower the way it comes up. That's because originally in Taiwan it was kind of a cartel, though it was complicated. Sometimes it was open up more, sometimes it was closed down more. There was a state-owned factories that were very important. But that also grows a lot, during the 1960s and 70s, it peaks. And then the mid-1970s, other countries are producing pineapples cheaper. Okay. The pineapple producer, though, are important because they're canners. And the pineapple season is a short season. It doesn't last the whole year. And so there's periods that these canneries don't have much to do. So they're always looking for other things they can can. That gives a chance for the vegetable booms. Okay. The two vegetable booms here, one is mushrooms. Okay. From 1960, almost no mushrooms produced or exported in Taiwan, or very few produced and none exported. Okay. By late 1970s, they quickly reach a peak at 120,000 tons of mushrooms being exported. Okay. This was, again, a fast reaction to an opening market. This is not in a Japanese market. This is sending mushrooms, I think, mainly to the United States. But the most impressive of the booms was the asparagus boom. Okay? The asparagus boom, in 1964, there's still no asparagus being produced in Taiwan. Hardly anybody in Taiwan knows what an asparagus is. It's just not part of the cuisine here. Okay? Then they discover that they can produce asparagus as good as California asparagus, and they can produce it cheaper. Okay? And suddenly farmers just rush into the asparagus production. You get this huge increase in asparagus production. By about 1971, okay, you've already reached this peak in asparagus production, maybe about 125,000 tons of asparagus being shipped out of Taiwan every year. Okay? And this asparagus boom lasts about 10 years. Then there's other countries out there that figure out that this is a good opportunity. Our labor costs are slower. They move a little slower, but finally they get involved, and then the Taiwan industry retreats. Taiwanese need to find something else they can produce. So the government originally was trying to kind of keep the agricultural sector just being kind of a steady producer of food for the country. They weren't really interested in these, in agricultural exports, except for sugar and rice, which was done by the government. Okay? But vegetables and fruit are labor-intensive crops that don't need much land, so the land reform doesn't affect them much. They're a good opportunity for these farmers, okay, that have they're having a hard time finding stuff that their land can produce that's going to really make a profit for them, okay, and so they're looking around the world. They're trying to find things, the crops that they can do that can actually make money. And when somebody finds a crop that makes money, everybody swarms in. Okay? And that's one of the key things about the Taiwan production and Taiwan trade is the swarming. Okay? Taiwanese don't always come up with the new ideas, but when somebody comes up with a new idea, the Taiwanese find about it really quick, and then they're all onto that idea. Okay? So that's kind of what the boom was all about, okay, during this period, mid-1960s, taking this up to say about 1980 or so. Okay. In the next section, I want to look more carefully at what this speed-intensive comparative advantage was really all about, okay, and what exactly are the characteristics of speed-intensive production.